the European diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, and thank you all for coming on what's a very clear day. You can almost see the future from here, rather than the usual fog. We're very lucky today to have one of the great Dutchmen of our time, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, or Hoop de Scheffer, if I'm pronouncing it properly.
More or less.
Who had been foreign minister, but I think more interesting probably for our purposes today, was Secretary General of NATO from 2004 to 2009. And those were very crucial years for NATO. I've come in and out of covering NATO, and I remember having an interview with Jaap when he was Sec Gen. I think, sadly, I've interviewed every NATO Secretary General since Lord Carrington. NATO survives. I mean, the question always was, if NATO is the answer, what is the question? But I think today we can begin to answer it. And one way we can begin to answer it is to go back to one of the key moments when Jaap was a NATO Secretary General. We're on the eve of the Munich Security Conference, which starts Friday. This has become a great extravaganza. It started in 1963 as a very small group of German and mostly American experts. Now it's become the kind of Davos of the foreign policy world. But in 2007, and we have a bit of a clip here, there was a famous speech from Vladimir V. Putin. So why don't we run that? Let's try to run it.
Putin always works.
If not, I can explain it. I know, exactly. And anyway, this was the speech, I think it's the only, when Putin came basically to warn the West. Okay, here you go.
I am truly grateful to be invited to such a representative conference that has assembled politicians, military officials, entrepreneurs and experts from more than 40 nations. This conference's structure allows me to avoid excessive politeness and the need to speak in roundabout, pleasant but empty diplomatic terms. We are seeing a greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law. And independent legal norms are, as a matter of fact, coming increasingly closer to one state's legal system. One state, and of course, first and foremost, the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way. This is visible in the economic, political, cultural and educational policies it imposes on other nations.
Great. So this was pre-Botox Vladimir Putin, but this was also a very strong warning, I think, to what was then clearly the world's hyperpower. And how did you, as NATO Secretary General, how did you see that speech, Jaap?
Well, it was, as things go in Munich, immediately after he delivered that speech. It was, of course, the talk of the Bayerischer Hof, talk of the town, that it would have the consequences it has had afterwards was difficult to foresee. But what was the case then, and what still is the case now, is that neither NATO nor the European Union has any form of consensus on what Russia policy should look like. And that is still, I think, a fairly important point of weakness, both in the EU and in NATO. Putin knows this. And we've also found out that when Putin draws a red line, he abides by it. I mean, he enforces it if necessary. But it was a watershed. But when you would ask me, and that's what you do, did you realize 10 minutes afterwards? No, not yet. But it's right that we're showing this clip.
But I mean, we were both together, though, in very separate roles at the Bucharest summit, 2009, I think?
2008.
2008,
yeah.
When the same Господин Putin crashed the NATO dinner.
Yeah.
and which was quite shocking all by itself. And as I reported at the time, gave a very strong warning to all NATO leaders gathered there that their plan of bringing Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance was going to cross a red line for him. And in the end, partly because of a compromise that I'm curious what you think of it. I mean, the conclusion was to tell Ukraine and Georgia, no, you can't join MAP, you can't join the process of getting into NATO, but don't worry, one day we promise you'll be in NATO, which many people think led then to the war in Georgia, and then even to Russian activities in Ukraine, because the idea of Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO became this great red line. I mean, so what was your sense when Putin came and crashed the dinner?
Well, first of all, when he crashed the dinner, he was sitting next to my wife, who enjoyed an evening with Vladimir Vladimirovich without any doubt, talking about education and what else. Next morning, when I met Putin, by the way, he said, not tongue-in-cheek, without humor, you must know, Secretary General, I'd rather talk to your wife than to you. But this whole summit, it was not my finest hour, Steve, I must admit. To go a bit back into history, I had a dinner before I met President Bush to prepare for the Bucharest summit with Condoleezza Rice, Sec-State, Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, and Stephen Hadley, Bush's National Security Advisor. All three of them were against what has happened at the summit a week afterwards. I remember Bob Gates telling me, we're not going to wage war on Article 5 because of Georgia, are we? But the president went in completely the other direction. He wanted to push this, and the communique finally, after a huge battle between Bush on the one hand and Sarkozy and Merkel on the other hand, was indeed, as you say, they will become NATO members, and they, Ukraine and Georgia. No map, but they will become NATO members. When, the question when was of course not answered. I think in retrospect, I defended this as Secretary General because this was the decision. Sure. And we know the expression, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. I was the grass. There you see the limits of a NATO Secretary General. I had to defend that decision. It was the wrong decision. And with you, I see a straight line from April 2008, Bucharest, of course, to August 2008, the invasion in Georgia. That happened more or less immediately afterwards. And you can also draw that line, I think, as you rightly analyzed, into 2014, Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. It was a wrong decision. I do not exactly know why finally Merkel and Sarkozy accepted the phrase, they will become NATO members. The next morning, at that same conversation with Putin, he said to me, and I almost quote him when I tell you this, Secretary General, you'll understand this will not be. And I thought, let me play the naive Secretary General, and I asked him, what exactly do you mean? And then Putin's words were, and those I remember very well, I presume, Secretary General, you've read your own communique. So that was again announcing that he was not going to accept it, and I say it was not my finest hour, because with many others I underestimated the French and German positions, and I underestimated how strongly Bush, the president, the commander-in-chief, would push this, despite the fact that he had three of his most important advisors behind him who were of a completely different opinion, but that opinion you don't hear anymore, of course, then.
Right. How, as we jump ahead, how do you look at Putin now? I mean, one can see him, one can overestimate, it seems to me. I was based in Moscow for years. One can overestimate his control of everything, to be sure. But do you see him as hiding weakness at the moment, or still presenting a serious threat of destabilization to his neighbors? How do you take him now? And what should, whatever a geopolitical commission means, what should the European position be now toward Mr. Putin?
As far as Putin is concerned, what I take back from my meetings with him are two things. First of all, his absolute fear for regime change. Going back to Dresden, 1989, the fall of the wall in Dresden, his whole world fell apart. Wir sind das Volk. It was first Wir sind das Volk, and the next day it was Wir sind das Volk. That has left, I think, an important scar on his soul. And the second thing, which steers, I think, Putin as a leader, is his fear for Sunni Muslim fundamentalism inside the Russian Federation. And that explains, I think, why he, from the very beginning, has supported Assad in Syria, because he knows who he has, but he doesn't know who he gets. And whom he might get in Syria might well be a more radical Sunni regime. Those two elements together, I think, should be joined by what we all remember, Putin qualifying the end of the Soviet Union as a major geopolitical catastrophe, when you have lost hundreds of millions of people in the Second World War. To say it a bit too simple, I think, but in clear terminology, I want my empire back. And he knows that the word empire, you can't define the word empire in 2020 like the traditional definition of an empire. I want to control my near abroad in more today's terminology. And then again, a geopolitical commission. I think this city should be very careful about sloganism. What is a geopolitical commission? It's a bit like Global Britain. What is Global Britain? That's also a slogan in search of substance. And I can understand the new Commission President having the ambition to see the European Union more geopolitical and to be less a soft power union in a hard power environment. It's a problem that you can't blame the EU for that. It is a soft power union. It was never meant to have hard power. But a geopolitical commission, a Green Deal, a strategic autonomy, be careful with those slogans. Yeah. Because before you know, they might end up like another slogan or another event, which is called the Lisbon Agenda. Right. What has come of the Lisbon Agenda? So be a bit careful. Certainly on the strategic autonomy point in the security and defense domain without Great Britain. What's left? Yeah. La France. Fine, Macron has ideas about the European Union. You might agree, you might disagree, but I respect him for the ideas he has. But in Berlin, the silence is complete, deadly silence. Yeah. And after what's happening now in the CDU-CSU, I'm afraid that silence will go on for a while.
Yeah, I mean, one expects, well, we'll see what happens, but there's a lot of introspection now in Germany. There's always some reason for Germany to look inward lately instead of outward. You know, my guess is there'll be elections fairly soon. I don't think you get a new CDU leader without elections. I mean, I think one thing Annegret has proven to us is you cannot separate the job of CDU leader and Chancellor. And so we actually may be seeing, you know, faster than we expected, the end of Angela Merkel, or not, you know. We don't know. As the Russians would say, "Chort znает," only the devil knows. Just back.
But you agree, Steve, that
yes.
that's when we talk about the European Union after Brexit, when we talk about strategic autonomy, we need the Germans, at least politically. Absolutely. I mean, they will never be in the forefront militarily. We all know that. Right. But we need them politically. I mean, the Dutch, speaking as a Dutchman, the Dutch, of course, with Brexit, have lost an important anchor of their foreign policy. And that's not exclusively for the Dutch. We need the Germans, and the Germans, they don't make any noise, any sound, which in my is for me reason for great concern.
Well, how do you see? I mean, you have it regularly in in your own country, but the fragmentation of the big parties, right? The great Christian democratic parties and the parties of the sort of basically center-left seem to be cracking. And then you get Die Linke and you get AfD. I mean, what sort of impact is this? I mean, who actually is strong enough to push Europe ahead? I mean, even Macron, I mean, who seems unassailable, after all, essentially has a base of 25 to 27%.
And he can't do it all by himself in Europe. What's interesting politically, I think, and I come back to Germany again, is that Merkel, in fact, is now punished politically for the fact that she has brought the CDU to the middle. And forgotten about the mantra which has always, for decades, been the important thing in Germany. CDU, CSU should never allow any serious political party on the right. That has happened because we now have the AfD. You see it, by the way, again, it's not exclusively Germany. You see it in the Netherlands, you see it happening as well. I'm a Christian Democrat, and my party was already split a few years ago when there was a discussion, should we go with the Freedom Party of the Dutchman Geert Wilders, for the non-Dutch, Mozart-like
very
politician.
Blonded.
That wasn't a success. But now, not nationally, not on the national level, but on the provincial level, in the province of Brabant, the question is again, should the Christian Democrats, it goes for the Liberals, the VVD as well, but should they in the province join hands and go into a coalition with this party, which is now called the Forum for Democracy from Thierry Baudet? And that threatens again to split. That's why it's interesting to see what's going to happen in Germany. Because all the potential all but one of the potential contenders, and that is Laschet, the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, both Friedrich Merz and Jens Spahn are to the right of Merkel, right. and so is the outsider Söder from Bayern. So lots of things will have to happen in Europe politically. Coming again to my own country, I think we have to get used to minority governments. It's almost impossible now, given the fragmentation, of building a stable government. And what I note is that again, not exclusively in the Netherlands, but in the middle, the political middle in Europe, I think has left the debate too much to the flanks, be they on the left or be they on the right.
And then we see, it becomes a bit of a cliche, but you see the normalization of the extremes, or certainly of the far right. Now, in a place like Norway, it seems to have worked okay, because once people are in power, they kind of have to deal with real things. But in Germany, I think it's a little more scary. Even though it should be said, AfD is mostly strong in the east, and it's only about 12 to 14% nationwide. But still, with the fragmentation of power, the temptation for the CDU to play that game and to move more on those policy positions must be very strong. But one of the things I do want to ask you, just back, to security issues, as Macron thinks about European autonomy and European positioning, particularly with a Trump, right? And if Trump is actually re-elected, right, things could change in a much more fundamental way. I mean, are you worried that he seems to be playing footsie with Moscow a little bit, or do you think this is kind of a given?
Well, as the Economist wrote a few weeks ago, Macron has many talents, but his greatest talent is not to predict reactions on what he's saying. What he said on Russia might be necessary at a certain stage. I would, by the way, give priority to, certainly when Trump would be re-elected, to see how we can rebuild any form of trust in the transatlantic relationship, because what is the major problem there, and NATO's major problem, lack of trust. all presidents, all US governments, all European governments in NATO and in the transatlantic relationship, trust was always written with a capital T. And that trust now has gone. That's not entirely and 100% Trump's fault, although he has contributed substantially to the destruction of trust. It is also, and then we're back to Europe and the European Union again, it is also due to the fact that we in the European Union, and I say then again, Macron, I credit Macron that with his European intervention initiative, he at least tries to establish some kind of, would we ever have coalitions of the able and willing,
right.
when it might be necessary to project hard military power. The southern border of the European Union is not the Mediterranean, it is in Africa. It is in the Sahel, where the French all by themselves at the moment are in Mali. Projecting hard power, if things go wrong in the Sahelian zone, and they might go wrong, migration, climate change, terrorism, and ungovernable nations and territories, radicalism, can we then ring the doorbell of the White House? Trump or no Trump, Trump or Obama or Bush? Yes. If it's Sahel, I hope the Americans, by the way, do not withdraw completely from the continent Africa. But then Macron at least proposes something we might do outside the EU structures, outside the institutions, which might for the addicts might not be the right way to go. But I'm a bit realistic by now. If it's the choice between nothing or a coalition of the able and willing, that's why we need the Brits, by the way. Yeah. So one of the major challenges in this city is, apart from trade and fisheries, how can we keep the United Kingdom as close as possible in the domain of security and defense? Mm-hmm. Should we have a European Security Council? Should we do it? Should we do it in any other way? Should we expand the German-French Treaty of Aachen and invite the UK or other nations to? I mean, there are all kinds of theoretical possibilities, right. But without the Brits, after the French, the only nation with a tradition of projecting power, it will simply not work. Mm-hmm. You cannot tell the Dutch or the Belgians or the Latvians, okay, you go and you run an operation, hard power projection in the Sahel.
I mean, certainly Brexit Britain wants to maintain its security position. I mean, its role in NATO is very important to it. Its role as a nuclear power, they're devoting a huge amount of their defense budget. Some people think much too much of their defense budget to renewing Trident and building new subs, but this is very important to their image of a global regional player. So I think that's true. What worries them, of course, is that in this long negotiation, and we're now in chess-beating time between Brussels and Boris, that somehow defense and security will be used as a bargaining chip by Brussels. And you know, personally, I hope that doesn't happen, no. Because if Europe is to have any kind of strategic, call it autonomy, call it something else, I mean, most Americans hate the word autonomy because it means alone. Then
which is what Trump likes, by the way.
Yes, well, that's it. So, I mean, that's part of what I want to ask you about. Going back to the great Macron interview, where he, you know, to a very good economist, correspondent, Sophie Petter, kind of let loose his think tank brain on lots of issues, but much like Trump, he also raised questions about Article 5. I mean, he wondered whether the French would be willing to go to war for a country like Montenegro. And I wonder what you thought of that. I mean, is Article 5 in question now because of Trump, because of Macron? Or has deterrence been damaged by this kind of speculation?
Yes, I think it has. If you, as a French president, or as an American president for that matter, publicly question, and that, of course, there's a lot to say about Article 5 in these days of cyber and hybrid and what have you. NATO would not have an easy job if a nation would invoke Article 5 because of a cyber attack or a hybrid or whatever. But when the French president, France as a nuclear power, and the American president question Montenegro, question Article 5, it is Houston, we have a problem. How to solve that problem? Difficult. NATO is a political military alliance, and what we forget is the right order. NATO would never survive as a military alliance, were it only a military alliance. This group of eminent persons now under the leadership of Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO SecGen, is now, I think, going to try how can we make NATO more political. When I was a young second secretary in the Dutch delegation at NATO in the 70s of the 20th century, every North Atlantic Council had as point number 3 or 4 on the agenda. I was sitting there with my notepad to note down all the intelligent words my ambassador was saying. Statements on political subjects. Statements on political subjects. That was a fixed, every week, a fixed point in the NAC. And then the ambassadors went around the world. They analyzed and discussed ACR, whatever. I did not succeed in getting that back on the agenda, and I think it's still not back on the agenda. No. Let us only deal with what is directly relevant for NATO. Of course, the scope broadened when NATO became expeditionary, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and so on. But still, I think what's lacking in NATO is a serious, fully fledged political debate in a political organization. Very successful military operation, and Article 5 is at the heart of NATO militarily, but certainly also politically.
Because I mean, certainly as I read into Macron, I mean, this was really his criticism, was that militarily it functioned pretty well, and in fact deterrence has been enhanced. We now have American troops in Poland, right, which didn't used to have. We now have NATO troops along the border, and they're bigger than just goats tied to a stake. They actually can fight, at least for a bit. But his argument is that strategically NATO wasn't thinking, and that American unilateralism, I mean, he was speaking, it's very important to understand this interview. I mean, he was talking right after Trump unilaterally made this decision on troops pulling out of Syria, which he then kind of backed off on. But Macron was angry, I think rightfully so, because French troops were exposed, other troops were exposed. But I mean, brain death is extreme, but I mean, do you think he has a point about NATO not thinking properly ahead?
He does.
Of what it should be doing?
He does, absolutely. Yeah. That is better said than what I try to do. That is, NATO is not political enough. Militarily, it functions more or less. Of course, we have the perennial discussions about defense and percentages, and Trump saying the same, but in harsher language, what all US presidents have said before. But as long as NATO has this lack of a political discussion, we already discussed the lack of a Russia policy. I could add that there is, of course, a rather fundamental difference inside the alliance. When you go south to Spain, to Italy, to Greece, you hear completely different stories about what NATO should be, what NATO should do, than when you go to the Baltic states, or Poland for that matter. Understandable. But as long as you don't speak that out and make it clear, there is something lacking in the political domain in NATO. That worries me. I say for the second or third time now that publicly questioning Article 5 is unwise. Right. Unwise for Macron to do that. And of course, by definition, also unwise for Donald J. Trump to mention Article 5.
That's right. No, because I mean, the Pew just did a polling about NATO, and two things struck me. One, simply as an American, Trump's criticism of NATO has undermined Republican support for NATO in America, while NATO is generally much more popular among conservatives elsewhere. So, I mean, that was interesting. And the other interesting thing, which has frankly been going on for quite a long time, is that most members of NATO think America would come to their defense, but have no real interest in coming to anyone else's defense. But, you know, let's hope none of this happens. Let's talk about one of these other security, trade issues that Europe faces, which is China. And there's been quite a lot of talk about Huawei now. And I think we've got something.
Huawei has been under scrutiny since at least 2011 for its allegedly close ties to the Chinese government. Some US lawmakers and intelligence officials think that Huawei's hardware could also provide a backdoor for China's massive and sophisticated state surveillance apparatus. Huawei denies these allegations. American lawmakers and regulators have been fighting Huawei's introduction to the US market for years. All of this is happening before 5G potentially reshapes the telecom industry. 5G networks are super fast, and they're designed to support the next generation of the internet. 5G is supposed to power not only smartphones, but also driverless cars and web-connected factories. Huawei wants to become a major player in 5G outside of China, but it's facing pressure internationally because of cybersecurity concerns dogging the company. Remember, it's part of a years-long struggle between Huawei and those who worry about its alleged close connections to Chinese spies.
Well, I mean, last year at the Munich Security Conference, I went to a briefing of the head of the BND, the DGSE, and MI5, all three of them, the Germans, French, British, intelligence bosses. They all thought Huawei was dangerous. It was quite interesting, quite explicitly, and yet we have Britain saying, yes, we can manage this. There's a big debate going on in Germany about whether Huawei can be used or not. And of course, it's all part of the context of the dependence of Germany especially, but other countries in Europe, on China and trade, and export trade and investment. So I guess to ask the broad question, can Europe escape being caught between US and China on these issues? Is there a place for Europe to be itself and defend its own interests without being squeezed this way?
To a certain extent, we are already the nut in the cracker, which is, as we know, an uncomfortable position. On 5G, that's of course the most contested example you mentioned. As long as you realize, and I'm not at all a technical expert in this domain, but no, that 5G is not 4G plus, but it's something completely different. And when you also realize that in China there is basically no separation between the state and whatever company, and Huawei is one of them. But the more relevant question and remark you made at the end of your statement, why has it gone so far? Why has it come to a stage that we, with our Ericssons and Nokias, apparently are not in a position, and the Americans now, I read, have said we might invest in Ericsson and Nokia to provide an alternative channel. For me personally, Huawei is a question of security. It's not a technical question, it's a question of security. But then the experts tell me, you can say that, interesting. This was, by the way, a very strong message I got from a professor I highly respect, Joseph Nye from Harvard. He hammered it down on me. He said, Jaap, this is not technical. This is a matter of national security. Don't do it. Quoting Joe Nye. Why have we come to in a situation that apparently we are now not in a position that Ericsson and Nokia can develop a proper 5G network? Apparently, we have not invested enough. Apparently, we have not. Although I must add, Thierry Breton, I read the speech he made last week, I think, on the topic. He says we can do it on the basis of the technology we have. We have, as Europeans, apparently left it, and there comes the link with political and China policy, because we thought trade and earning money was more important than Uyghurs about human rights in Xinjiang, or Huawei for that matter. If there was any possibility for the European Union, there isn't, because the British have decided, the Dutch, we are a polar nation, as you know, so we go for Huawei at the edges, but not in the core. Germany might do something of the kind. Within the Five Eyes, as you mentioned, the intelligence community, even within the Five Eyes, there's no agreement. If I had to make a decision, I would not do it, because Huawei is Huawei. Huawei is the Chinese state. And I do not want the Chinese state, and I don't invent this on the spot. Somebody wrote on an internet site, I read, I cannot imagine that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, at the height of the Cold War, would have invited the KGB to be responsible for our networks.
At least not knowingly.
But again, is there an alternative? Is there technically an alternative?
I mean, this is one of the questions I have as a non-European, but with a lot of sympathy. Europe did Airbus, right? I mean, Europe's done fighter jets. Why can't it do 5G? There's no American competitor. You have two European companies. Unfortunately, neither of them are French or German, but still, big European companies. And one of the things people say about Huawei is it's done so well because it's had so much state aid, right? Probably in violation of all kinds of WTO rules. But I mean, couldn't this be a project for this European Union, or is that
it could,
a fantasy?
But that would need rethinking. And I heard Commissioner Verstager make a few remarks. That would also, in my opinion, mean that Brussels and the EU would have to rethink Siemens Alstom.
Yes, that's right.
And have a discussion on are we under all circumstances against creating quote-unquote European giants. Siemens Alstom, I think the Commissioner Verstager followed the rules. I mean, she had no marge de manœuvre to take another decision. But I think there are now proposals on her table that at least some nations, including my own, have said that we should be more serious in the vetting of where state aid is concerned. I'm still on the board of Air France KLM, the airliner, and the competition with the Gulf carriers is also not a fair competition. It's not a level playing field. So I think we should, here in Brussels, as European Union nation, but also the Commission, be more serious if we want to compete. It might well be that we have to leave fixed positions we have always had to match. I don't want to see the Chinese company GCC to come to Brussels in 2 years and say we can sell you high-speed trains for 1/3 of the price. That's not a good outcome, I think, for Europe. But again, competition is complicated, industrial policy is complicated. But Huawei is in my opinion, is a very, very serious warning.
No, and it's going to get more complicated if people are serious, as I hope they will be, about climate change and Green Deal, because if Europe is serious about defossilizing, then it's going to put European companies perhaps at a disadvantage in terms of global trade, unless there are things like carbon taxes and carbon border adjustments, which, would be very complicated. But, I think this is something Europeans ought to be thinking about. They can't just kind of demand their companies spend a lot of money to do a certain thing while other countries' companies aren't doing them, unless there's some way of leveling the playing field.
Yeah, and for the Green Deal, I would add that I would hope that some people in the European Union or in individual nations would have the opportunity to write a decent business case for nuclear energy. Yes. I think also the Commission is much too quickly saying that there is no business case. Yeah, haalt je de koekoek, we say in Dutch, which means that's logical if you're going to spend money on alternative sources. No oil, no fossils, wind, biomass, also rather polluting, I would say, but under no condition nuclear energy. It beats me how you then ever going to reach the Paris Climate Agreement parameters we have set for ourselves.
Well, what also worries me is that as you look at who produces carbon, I mean, Europe, I don't know what it's about 10% of the world's carbon. India, China, at least 40%, if not more. So you could all heat your tea with your breath, and the world would still end, unless we figure out some way of getting the rest of the world to behave, or if Europe develops the right technology to sell to everyone. Anyway, I'm going to come to the audience in a minute, so think of questions that you might want to ask Jaap, but while you do that, I'm going to ask one last question, which is, we have a new High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, whose tone already is very different, who's an experienced Spanish foreign minister who's been kind of outspoken on Libya, on the dangers of Libya. He's been outspoken on Idlib now and Syria. How do you judge this, and can it be turned into action, do you think?
Well, that's of course the big question. Can it be turned into action? I think if I were Josep Borrell, I would do the same, getting some color on the cheeks of the High Representative, which is not easy given the positions also of his predecessors. not easy in that rather hybrid position in the Commission and what have you. But the perennial question also for Borrell will be, where's the beef? I mean, Libya is an example of an intervention by the international community, because the Chinese and the Russians abstained in the Security Council. Putin regrets that till this very day, as we all know, but Medvedev was president, and Medvedev apparently didn't think twice.
He's been punished.
He's been punished. But Libya is, and NATO, and finally the European NATO members couldn't do it without the US, and it was only from the air. So, I mean, the beef for Libya, and I'm definitely not advocating an invasion, but the beef for Libya is, of course, that you do not only chase Gaddafi, killed by his own people at the end of the day, but the object of the exercise should also not have been the fact that Libya is now total chaos. Yes, that's right. Which for the non-interventionists will of course be the argument you see. You see when you do it half-heartedly, when you do it like this. On the other hand, you have Samantha Power, who has now written a book, of course, an interventionist. And she is honest in that book, because she said she realizes it is much more difficult when you are on the decision-making side,
yes, well, exactly,
than writing books about humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, yes, and what have you. Awfully difficult, but Libya is not a good example. Well, Afghanistan, the jury's still out, I would say. I must admit, I do not exactly understand the Afghanistan papers, in the sense that now people whom I know very, very well from my NATO days are saying we already knew in those days that nothing would come out of it. I have difficulty to understand them. They should have told us and me then, if it was all such a dramatic mess as comes out of the Afghanistan papers. But coming back to I understand Borrell. But I think humanitarian intervention is one of the most complicated, intervening militarily, one of the most complicated topics. Also in the European Union, where apart from the Brits in the European Union, but apart from the Brits and the French, there is no tradition and history of projecting hard power. I mean, we don't do that. We Dutch, we also have lots of neutrality in our DNA, which makes it not easy to say, okay, we're going in, but we want to have what the military call escalation dominance. We will have to escalate. If we have to escalate, we should be able to escalate. Oh, no.
No, that's right.
May I give you one example? I see my good friend and former colleague Hans van Wezel sitting here. A Dutchman always, quite rightly, mentioned Srebrenica. If I look back to my position then in Parliament on Srebrenica, where the armored vehicles went, but the gun which was on the armored vehicle looked much too aggressive. So the gun was removed, and there was a much lighter caliber gun or machine gun on the armored vehicles. There was no way we could escalate if we had wanted to. Anyway, I'm not going to reopen the Srebrenica debate, but it was a lesson also for me personally that when you go in, you have to do it in a way that you have always the freedom to escalate. But that is not in the DNA of the European Union. So I'm not, I don't know if I should use the word optimistic here, I'm not optimistic that this European culture will change.
It's a very good point. I've watched in Kosovo, other places, how the British manage escalation dominance. And, it's very professional. I think differently about Srebrenica, not to press on this wound, but 7,000, 8,000 people died, and we all said, never again, never again. And in Syria, we stopped counting. And it's just this endless shame, I think.
May I make a cynical remark, Steve, on Srebrenica? I can't prove what I'm going to say now, but I can say it. I'm in the comfortable position that I speak only on behalf of myself. Had there been a French or British battalion in Srebrenica, this would not have happened. Because they would have had the opportunity to say, if New York doesn't want us to escalate, because as you know, the Dutch F-16 of the starfighters F-16s were not allowed to bomb one single bomber drop. Right. I cannot imagine that ever a French president or a British prime minister would have accepted that battalion being there and not going in to see if they could prevent what happened afterwards. Genocide on European soil in our backyard.
Yes. Well, these things, I mean, John Mearsheimer, who is an American realist, he calls himself. He's at University of Chicago, also a West Pointer, which is one of the interesting things about him. But he once said to me, and I think about this, he said, we Americans especially, we look at these awful people sitting on volcanoes. We look at Saddam Hussein, we look at Gaddafi, and we think, these are terrible, terrible people. And we knock them off. And then we watch all this lava pouring down, and we go, oh, wow, what do we do now? So, on that happy thought, we have about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So I'm sure people in the audience would like to ask Jaap questions, and please feel free. I see a hand there, and then this woman there, and if there are microphones, and if you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure, Bart Shevchik at GMF and the European Commission. Thank you very much for your remarks, and I wanted to pick up on your point on restoring the trust in the transatlantic relationship. And on the Democratic side, I wanted to ask you, who do you like the best in terms of being able to do that, to the extent that you follow the primary debates? Thank you.
I do follow the primary debates, but I would not have a clue, I must admit, who the Democratic Party could field. I still think, but there might be much more mature experts in the room. I still think that you don't win U.S. presidential elections on the left. So Bernie Sanders, first of all, he has to cross the hurdle of his own Democratic establishment, which is not very keen of having him on the ticket. So that's point number one. Point number two, if you see what has happened up till now, also with Joe Biden, who now really has to win South Carolina and other states, because otherwise he might be out. I still don't see But I mean, it's still a long way to go till November in political terms. I do not see yet a Democratic candidate who might be in a position to beat Donald J. Trump with the economy in the US as it is. I mean, look at unemployment, look at how the economy is running. So that's a huge plus for Trump. But I don't dare to predict and to give you a name. If I were a Democrat in the US, I would be concerned and worried. If Michael Bloomberg, can he still buy himself into the ticket? I do not know.
Early days yet.
Early days.
Ma'am, you had your hand up.
Hi, my name is Manon Lebla. I work at the European External Action Service on cyber issues. And I had a question about deterrence. So we spoke about deterrence, and in cyber we actually have the 4 kinds of deterrence from Joseph Nye, which are often taken as an example. And one of the forms of deterrence is deterrence by entanglement, which basically mean linkages between a state's ecosystem economically, but also technologically. So from that perspective, you could say that the approach that the EU has taken is basically remaining linked to other economies that would actually contribute to security and defense. And how would you see, with basically everybody around us going on their own, how would you see the role for the EU to actually keep this entanglement between great powers?
Good question.
Oh, that's an excellent question. Let me start by saying what I should have said before. That I have to correct myself from time to time, talking about the US and Trump, of not sufficiently realizing, despite the lack of trust in the transatlantic relationship, that booing Trump is not a policy. I mean, we have to engage with the Trump administration. Also, when Trump is re-elected in November, we have to engage. So that entanglement, and that's relevant for the European Union. For the EU, then, it is important that we do not fall into what I call the bilateral trap. The Chinese like bilateral much more than going to the EU institutions. So do the Americans. So does Trump. And then I see Italy having a bilateral MOU on the basis of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which is wrong. We should tell those guys, come to Brussels. But from our side, we should also, including with the Trump administration, we should engage. Coming back to entanglement, I think this is a question both for the member states of the European Union as well as for the Commission. By the way, to keep that form of deterrence, in Joe Nye's definition, more or less alive. But I'm also here, I'm not extremely optimistic in this regard. Huawei is a good example. Where will we end with Huawei? Will we end indeed by anybody going it on his or her own, or is there still a possibility of doing things together? Otherwise, we'll see this form of deterrence evaporate, I'm afraid. But I don't know what your own opinion is. You're much more the expert than I am.
This gentleman there, yeah, could just stand up so the mic can find you there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Tim Eestemans, Westphalia Global Advisory. One word actually, Turkey. Looking at how Turkey is entangled in Syria, fighting with the Russians, in Libya, fighting with almost everyone, and in the Western Balkans, also not acting in European interests, so to say. But at the same time, it will have a big platform, for instance, the Munich Security Council. To what extent is Turkey still a trustworthy and desirable partner within NATO?
My answer to your question is, and there I think you and I will agree, geography matters in international relations. Geography is key. If Turkey wasn't geographically where it is, we would have long told Erdogan, listen, my friend, this is unacceptable. Now we say it's unacceptable that he's buying S-400 Russian weaponry, but we say it's unacceptable, but we don't do much about it. Why don't we do much about it? Because Turkey is where it is. The bridge to Eurasia, the bridge to the Middle East. I mean, I don't have to explain this in this company. So it might sound cynical, but I am afraid we have to live with it. That doesn't mean that we cannot criticize Turkey. On top of this all comes the rope we have around our necks in the framework of migration and the migration agreement with Erdogan, which gives him, of course, a pawn of high value in that debate. We have now to see what is going to happen in Idlib. And as a consequence of what Assad will consider the final attack on Idlib, what that's going to mean in numbers of people pushing to the Turkish border. I have been for a long time. I've changed my opinion apparently. For a long time, I thought. That's quite some time ago, before Erdogan came, that at the end of the day it might well be that Turkey would come very close to the European Union. Those days, of course, are gone and they will not come back. And I had my hopes that a dominantly Islamic society could, etc. Well, that is completely impossible. But again, look at how long the NATO-EU relationship was poisoned. By the Turks in NATO, I should add, by the Greeks and the Cypriots on this side of Brussels and of the European Union. But I found out the hard way, also in my NATO years. Yeah, Turkey is where it is, and in the confines of the North Atlantic Council, there will certainly be critical remarks. But I have not seen any senior or not senior European leader publicly criticizing Turkey. I haven't seen them, and I've given you my argument for why we haven't seen them. Mm-hmm. Turkey is where it is. Geography matters.
And part of what interests me about Turkey, it's just that we forget how politically divided it is now. I mean, Erdogan's much weaker than he was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So things are in flux, and so it's. One should be, not be too predictive about where Turkey will end up. But I mean, you're right. I mean, there's a kind of silence about that. There's a silence about the Uyghurs. There's a bit of a silence on Syria. These are complicated things for certainly Brussels to discuss. Other questions? Yes, sir. And then, actually, why don't we go right behind you, just because it's closer, and then we'll come to you. Please identify yourself, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Farida. I'm a confused citizen at this moment, if a citizen at all.
You're not the only one.
Thank you. So I moved to Brussels last week to work for the European Commission. And I was telling my dad back home in Holland that I was going to this meeting. My brother was sitting there as well, and he was like, well, interesting. You are going to work for the European Commission, supposed to be representing me, and you're going to talk to someone or be in the same room as someone who worked for an organization that's supposed to defend my nation state. But, and this is my brother, and he is an Arab Muslim Dutch citizen who will probably never be regarded as a Dutchman. So when we started off this conversation, you said I would like to introduce you as a Dutchman. And I'm asking this question because he said, what is the EU going to do for me? Because if I run and try and catch my train, people may be scared that I'm going to blow up the train. And you're going to work for a commission that's supposed to defend my rights, and talk to someone who worked for an institution that's supposed to respect my nation state. But my nation state is maybe afraid of me and will maybe never recognize me as a full citizen. And when you touched upon what happened in Libya and that Gaddafi was killed by his own people, and if you look at a lot of global dynamics, his question was actually, is the NATO still relevant for if we look at how people feel and trust, and the trust vis-a-vis the citizens and their nations? So I thought, I'm not sure what exactly my question is, but I'd like you to
Exactly.
reflect.
No, yeah.
Okay,
I would say you're not the only one either.
that's very honest.
But
Yeah.
first of all, let me say that I am sad when you say that your brother will never consider it, because that's about our nation state, your nation state, and my nation state will not never consider it a citizen. I think if you look at Brussels, if you look at us, if you look at the elite, and we are all the elite as we're sitting here in this room, very much the elite. I think what we have neglected, and what the European Union, that's all of us, has neglected over the years, is what the British professor, you've heard of him, Stephen, David Goodhart, mentioned, the somewheres. We are all anywheres in his reasoning, very, very briefly. We are globalists, we are traveling from A to B on airplanes, we're going on holiday this year to Bali and next year to Patagonia, renting a four-wheel drive. The anywheres. The somewheres, and we thought that we could take the somewheres in that same equation, the somewheres who are much less educated, who are usually not social liberal, this is still Goodhart's theory, who grow up and stay living in the city or the village or the province where they grew up, close to their parents. They ask themselves the question, what the heck is for me in globalization? The elite can say, fine, the Brussels elite, but the international elite. But I don't know what's in it for me. I have been left out. That is an analysis which is on the mark, but it is not so very easy to find the right answer to that analysis. I must admit, because in Dutch politics we have not yet, including myself, not yet found the right answer to that question. And that's the reason that the European Union, as we all know, has also become a sort of darts board where people can project their anger, together with a lot of other things. But the European Union is one of them. I think that when we discuss democracy, and that was also part of your intervention, democracy, whatever way you look at it, is very much as a concept linked to the nation state. And that we should not forget. Also not as Europeans, and I'm a European, although not a federalist, but I'm a convinced European. So that is our homework, and that is a huge task. If I remember correctly, your final remark was on NATO. I still think that despite everything Steve and I have discussed, I still think that when there is a real serious crisis, an Article 5 quote-unquote crisis, there is enough solidarity within NATO to adhere to the principle one for all and all for one. But now I'm coming back to the question about cyber and about cyber attacks, about hybrid. What exactly would happen in 2020 in the case of a very sophisticated hybrid attack? Because we should not fight previous wars. I mean, conflicts are not about huge armies facing each other anymore. Conflicts are much more complicated. What then would be the political answer of NATO? What then would be the discussion in the North Atlantic Council? It's hard to predict, but it would be extremely complicated. I participated in an exercise, a tabletop exercise here on the other side of Brussels about half a year ago. And I can tell you, I came back from that tabletop exercise rather gloomy, because I had been confronted with problems. I had never been realizing that is part of modern conflict. A data cable, undersea data cable, destroyed. Question, why is there not a second data cable? Who can repair the data cable? No government could repair the data cable. Only the private company which had led the data cable could repair the... I mean, these kind of things. What happens in those scenarios, I don't know, but I came back from that exercise, I must say, rather gloomy. But on the core, I still think NATO is alive and kicking.
A very complicated answer to a complicated question.
Absolutely.
We have time for one more. This gentleman here.
Thanks, Steve. Nick Guttridge from The Sun, so you can probably guess what this is going to be about. Stephen mentioned in his remarks the kind of concerns that the security and defence relationship with Britain might get, dragged in with all the political negotiations and everything that's going on. The member states are still putting together Michel Barnier's mandates for the relationship, but so far the wording is pretty tough in terms of third-party involvement in EU defence cooperation, what you can and can't do. So I just wanted to get your view really on where you think the EU is at and where it should be. Is it being kind of too strategically short-sighted in terms of treating Britain like any other country around the world on defence cooperation? Should it be looking to carve out something special? And if Britain is treated like any other partner around the world, kind of what that holds in terms of European security?
I think what I don't know the exact mandate, but what my answer to your question would be that if the Brits would hope that, as I gave in one of my answers, that we are so keen to keep the UK involved in security and defence matters, and that means that the EU would be flexible on fisheries and regulation. I think that would be a mistake for London from the British side. It is an important point, but I would not expect and I would not favour the European Union making this a bargaining chip for all the other dossiers on the table in the negotiations. But having said that, I think it is an EU interest, but also very much a UK interest to keep as closely linked. And I've given you a few examples. I mean, that can also be done by other means. I mean, European Security Council, not easy, who are in, who are out, what's the kind of decision making. You can have long and short stories about that. My ambition would be to keep the Brits as closely knit and linked to the European Union where it concerns matters of security and defence. But the big but is, capital B, don't have the illusion that ambition would lead to a lot of flexibility on fishing waters and what have you. That would be my answer. And I would be interested if Nicola Sturgeon gets it her way and the Scots are going where some of the Scots might want to go, where you're going to find a place for the Trident submarines. But anyway, that's for another afternoon.
That's right. Well, before I declare the bar open, please join me in thanking Jaap de Hoop Scheffer for his thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the bar is now open. Thank you.
Many thanks.
It was great fun.
Many thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. Okay.
One,
Thank you so much. That's all.